The heavy silver tray felt impossibly cold against Alira Solis's collused hands. She kept her head bowed as she navigated the winding, drafty corridors of the Ironfall Keep, her steps measured and completely silent. The autumn wind howled against the high stained glass windows, rattling the leaded frames and sending a bitter chill through the damp stone walls. The Southern Territory was supposed to be a place of enduring warmth, a fertile haven for its dominant pack. But this year, the frost had arrived early, creeping over the dying crops and sinking into the very foundations of the estate. It was a physical manifestation of the decay that Alira could smell in the air, a slow, inevitable rot that no one else seemed to notice. She paused, just before the grand archway leading out to the terraced rose garden, adjusting her grip on the tray. The delicate porcelain teacups trembled slightly, clinking against the polished silver. Alira forced her breathing to slow. She was an Omega. She was the lowest-ranking member of the pack, a servant hidden away in the dark kitchens, despite the crescent-shaped claiming mark that throbbed constantly on her left hip. It had been 3 weeks since the private, rushed ceremony in the pack's ancestral chapel. 3 weeks since she had been bound to the most powerful man in the territory, only to be immediately ordered back to her scrubbing brushes and laundry tubs. The garden beyond the archway was supposed to be a place of quiet refuge. Instead, it became the moment Alira's entire world shattered. The voices drifted through the frost-bitten rose bushes before she even stepped onto the gravel path. Alira froze in the shadows of the stone pillar, the heavy tray suddenly feeling like an anchor threatening to drag her down into the earth. "You cannot seriously intend to present her at the winter solstice, Rowan." The voice belonged to Maria Sterling. It was a voice like honey poured over shattered glass, sweet, practiced, and deeply cruel. The aristocratic mistress stood near the center fountain, wrapped in an exquisite crimson silk cloak that stood out sharply against the dying grey garden. Even from a distance, the overwhelming scent of her thick gardenia perfume assaulted Alira's heightened senses. It was a cloying, heavy fragrance, deliberately crafted to mask the faint, sickly scent of rot that always seemed to follow the woman. Rowan Vance stood beside her, leaning against the frozen stone of the fountain. The alpha of the Ironfall pack wore his heavy velvet coat, his broad shoulders tense, as he looked out over his failing lands. He was a man of immense physical power, respected and feared across the southern borders. Yet in this moment, his storm-grey eyes were entirely focused on the manipulative woman at his side. "She is a formality, Maria," the alpha replied, his tone flat and utterly devoid of the warmth a mate should possess. The elders demanded a traditional claiming to pacify the traditionalists in the lower packs. "I did what was required for the stability of the territory. A formality who scrubs floors," the mistress laughed, stepping closer to trace a gloved finger down the lapel of his coat. "Look at her, Rowan. She is weak. She cannot even shift into a full wolf form. The pack whispers about her defective nature constantly. You cannot truly believe a wolfless creature will ever give you a strong heir. She is barren dirt. She is an embarrassment to your bloodline." Alira stopped breathing. The air in her lungs turned to solid ice. She waited for her husband to speak. She waited for the fierce, protective instinct of the alpha wolf to rise up and defend his chosen mate. She waited for the feral growl that would put the arrogant aristocrat in her place. Rowan merely sighed, reaching up to cover Maria's gloved hand with his own. "You are right. She is a hollow vessel, a weak necessity that I have already grown tired of maintaining. Once the political unrest settles before the first snow, I will dissolve the bond quietly. I will announce you as my chosen Luna. My true legacy will not come from her." The claiming mark on Alira's hip, which had pulsed with a dull, hopeful ache for 21 days, suddenly felt as though it had been plunged into a freezing river. The familiar warmth that tied her soul to the alpha vanished instantly. In its place, a cavernous void opened up, a terrifying absence that sucked the heat from her blood and the strength from her knees. The physical pain was blinding. It was a somatic severing, an agonizing frost that crawled up her spine and wrapped tightly around her throat. She closed her eyes, leaning her shoulder heavily against the cold granite pillar as the world spun. An invisible shadow leaves no trace when it vanishes. The old proverb echoed in the hollow space of her mind. She had spent her entire life trying to be small, trying to be useful, hoping that quiet obedience would eventually earn her a place of safety. She had accepted the secrecy of their bond, trusting Rowan's promises that he just needed time to prepare the pack. He had never intended to prepare them. He had intended to erase her. Slowly, Elira opened her eyes. The tears that should have fallen did not come. The agonizing heartbreak that had gripped her chest only seconds ago rapidly crystallized into a desolate, absolute clarity. She did not look at the Alpha again. Instead, she looked down at her own colloosed hands, holding the silver tray, and then her gaze dropped to the heavy wool of her apron. Beneath the coarse fabric, her abdomen was just beginning to show the slightest curve. She was not barren dirt. She was 4 months pregnant, and she was not carrying one heir, but 2. As if sensing their mother's sudden plunge into despair, the twins moved. It was a tiny, localized flutter, but it carried a profound, undeniable heat. A faint, glowing warmth radiated outward from her womb, pushing back violently against the freezing ice of the severed bond. It was the hidden golden fire of her ancestors. The dormant sun-born lineage she had kept concealed her entire life to survive in a world of wolves. If Rowan believed she was a broken, useless thing, he would not hesitate to cast her children into the freezing wilderness, or worse, use them as political pawns if they somehow displayed the divine power sleeping in their blood. She could not allow them to be born into a dying, poisoned pack ruled by a blind man and a rotting aristocrat. Elira did not gasp. She did not drop the tray. She simply took a slow, silent step backward, retreating into the shadows of the corridor. The silver teapot never made a sound. She navigated the labyrinth of the keep until she reached the lowest level of the servants' quarters. The stone walls down here were damp, smelling of lye soap and old wood smoke. She pushed open the heavy oak door to the kitchens, her face completely drained of color, her storm-grey eyes locked in a state of absolute, unyielding focus. Nora Lindwood was standing by the massive hearth, wiping down the wooden butcher blocks. The older servant paused, the rag stilling in her worn hands as she took in the sight of the young Omega. The kind-hearted woman had survived 3 different alphas in this keep, and her eyes held a quiet, tragic understanding of the cruelty the nobility inflicted on the lower ranks. "My lady," the servant whispered, quickly stepping forward to take the heavy silver tray from Elira's rigid grip. She did not use the title mockingly. She was the only soul in the keep who honored the secret mating ceremony. "I am leaving, Nora," the Omega said. Her voice was barely more than a breath, yet it carried the weight of falling iron. "I am leaving tonight, before the storm breaks." The older woman did not argue. She did not ask questions or offer empty platitudes about her husband's temper. She simply looked at the young woman's pale face, glanced down at the slight swell of her stomach hidden beneath the apron, and nodded slowly. "The main gates will be locked by dusk, and the western patrols are doubled because of the harvest," Nora murmured, her tone shifting immediately into practical logistics. She reached under the counter, pulling out a heavy dark wool cloak that belonged to the kitchen staff. "You must go through the lower catacombs, but the iron doors are heavy. Child, you will need a distraction." "I do not just need a distraction," Elira replied, pulling the thick wool cloak over her shoulders. The fabric smelled of wood smoke and safety, grounding her racing pulse. "I need to enter the pack vault." Nora's eyes widened in genuine shock, her breath hitching. "The vault?" "The Alpha's guards stand at the threshold day and night. It is forbidden to the lower ranks. What could you possibly need from the dark that is worth risking the executioner's block?" "What is rightfully mine," the young mother answered softly. She did not explain further. She could not tell the servant about the ancestral sunstone. The ancient relic had been stolen from her own bloodline centuries ago during the Pack Wars, locked away in the dark by alphas who did not understand its true nature. To Rowan, the stone was merely a symbol of dominion, a dead rock sitting on an obsidian pedestal, but Elira knew the truth. It was the elemental heart of the land, a geode of pure, dormant solar magic. Without its proximity, her unborn twins, who required immense magical energy to survive their gestation, would fade before she ever reached the northern borders. The Pack was already dying under Maria's toxic influence. Leaving the stone here to rot in the dark was a death sentence for her children. "I will handle the guards," Nora said finally, her voice steadying. She moved to the pantry, retrieving a large clay jug of spiced winter ale. "It is freezing in the lower halls. The sentries will not refuse a hot drink to warm their bones. When you hear the iron keys drop onto the stone floor, you will have exactly 5 minutes before the next patrol crosses the gallery." "Thank you," Elira whispered, pressing her hand briefly against the older woman's arm. It was a fleeting touch, but it conveyed a lifetime of gratitude. They moved in complete silence. The descent into the lower levels of the keep was a steep, treacherous path down spiral stone stairs. The air grew progressively colder, smelling of rust, dry earth, and ancient blood. The flickering torches cast long, distorted shadows against the weeping granite walls. Elira kept to the darkest corners, her breathing shallow, her hands resting protectively over her abdomen. At the bottom of the stairwell, 2 massive iron doors barred the entrance to the vault. 2 heavily armed sentries stood flanking the entrance, their breath plumbing in the freezing air. Elira pressed her back against the damp stone of the corridor, waiting in the suffocating darkness. Seconds stretched into agonizing minutes. Her claiming mark throbbed with a hollow, sickening rhythm, a constant reminder of the mate who had thrown her away. Then she heard the soft shuffle of footsteps. Nora's voice drifted down the hall, offering a cheerful, grandmotherly greeting. The low, gruff voices of the guards responded. There was the sound of clay mugs clinking, the pouring of hot ale, and a brief, fabricated story about a severe leak in the wine cellar that needed immediate attention. A heavy, metallic clatter echoed sharply off the stone walls. The keys, the heavy boots of the sentries marched quickly down the opposite corridor, lured away by the promise of warmth and the urgency of the fake emergency. Elira did not hesitate. She darted out from the shadows, her hands flying to the iron ring of keys resting on the freezing flagstones. She found the largest, rusted key and thrust it into the iron lock of the vault. It turned with a harsh, grating shriek that sounded deafening in the quiet catacombs. She threw her entire body weight against the heavy metal door, forcing it open just enough to slip inside before pulling it shut behind her. The Pack vault was cavernous. Dust motes danced lazily in the dim ambient light, provided by a few enchanted torches bracketed to the walls. The room was filled with the hoarded wealth of the Southern Territory. Chests of silver coins, racks of ancient weaponry, and tapestries depicting brutal Pack victories. Elira ignored all of it. Her eyes locked onto the center of the room. Resting on a pedestal of jagged black obsidian was the ancestral sunstone. It was the size of a melon, looking like a rough, unpolished geode. To an ordinary wolf it appeared dull and lifeless. But as the pregnant Omega approached, the air around the pedestal grew noticeably, profoundly warmer. It was a dry, comforting heat, like the first rays of dawn breaking through a long winter night. Elira reached out with a trembling hand. The moment her collused fingertips brushed the rough, crystalline surface of the relic, a violent reaction tore through her body. The claiming mark on her hip flared. It did not ache with the icy pain of the broken mate bond. Instead, a cascade of golden sparks erupted beneath her skin. A rush of pure molten heat flooded her veins, racing up her arms and diving straight into her womb. The stone recognized its true vessel. The twins kicked fiercely in response, absorbing the ancient solar magic like starving creatures finally offered a feast. The dim, dusty vault was suddenly bathed in a soft, radiant golden glow that emanated from the stone and reflected in Elira's storm-grey eyes. She pulled the heavy wool cloak from her shoulders, wrapping the massive artifact tightly within the thick fabric to muffle its glowing light. The physical weight of it was staggering. It pulled at her arms, straining her back, but the internal warmth it provided completely neutralized the freezing agony of her severed bond. She strapped the wrapped stone tightly to her chest, using a leather harness she had taken from the kitchen stores, securing it safely against her heart and her unborn children. By the time she slipped back out of the vault, locking the iron door and leaving the keys on the floor, the storm that had been brewing all afternoon finally broke over the Ironfall keep. Elira pushed through the hidden servants' egress at the base of the outer wall, stepping out into a raging thunderstorm. The freezing autumn rain lashed against her face, instantly soaking her hair and chilling her skin. The wind howled through the skeletal trees of the dark woods, a deafening roar that masked the sound of her boots, sinking deep into the sucking mud. She did not look back at the towering, dark silhouette of the castle. She did not look back at the Alpha who had mocked her, or the mistress who was currently poisoning his mind. The Ironfall pack had chosen their path, and they would reap the barren, desolate future they had sown. The road north was treacherous. It was a freezing, unforgiving wilderness, filled with rogue wolves and brutal elements. But as Elira stepped into the tree line, the heavy burden of the sunstone pressing against her chest, she felt no fear, only an absolute, unbreakable maternal resolve. By dawn, the rumors would begin to whisper through the servants' quarters. They would say she vanished like smoke through a crack in the world, and she took the child with her. They did not know there were two, and they did not know that the quiet, invisible Omega had just walked away with the entire future of the Southern Territory, wrapped securely in a worn woolen cloak. The Northern Territory was a landscape of brutal, uncompromising extremes. The jagged peaks of the Thornmere Mountains pierced the low-hanging grey clouds like the fangs of a sleeping titan. Below them, a vast expanse of crystalline permafrost stretched out toward the horizon, completely untouched by the creeping rot that plagued the southern lands. The wind here did not merely howl, it shrieked. It carried microscopic shards of ice that bit at exposed skin with a harsh, relentless cold. For 4 grueling days, Elira Solis had walked into the teeth of that wind. She did not complain. She did not beg the empty skies for mercy. She simply placed one shredded, blood-stained boot in front of the other, carving a solitary path through the knee-deep snowdrifts. Her body was operating far beyond the natural limits of a pregnant Omega. The claiming mark on her left hip, once a searing brand of fated connection, had faded completely. It was no longer a wound of passion or rejection. It had calcified into a hollow, faded scar of absence. The severance of a fated mate bond usually triggered a catastrophic failure of the nervous system in an Omega. Without the constant, validating flow of an Alpha's energy, the body would simply shut down, interpreting the profound rejection as a fatal wound. The victim would fall into a freezing sleep and simply fade away. But Elira was not surviving on the borrowed magic of a corrupt pack. She was surviving on the ancient, pulsating heart of a stolen god. The ancestral sunstone, strapped tightly to her chest beneath her heavy woolen cloak, continued to radiate a fierce, dry heat. It was a localized furnace of divine energy, fighting a desperate, invisible war against the apocalyptic cold of the northern blizzard. The stone sent waves of molten warmth directly into her womb, prioritizing the survival of the twins over the preservation of her own extremities. Her fingers were completely numb, her lips were cracked from the freezing wind. Yet the golden warmth resting against her heart pushed her forward. Every time she closed her eyes, tempted to surrender to the heavy, suffocating blanket of exhaustion, the twins moved. It was a sharp, demanding flutter of life that jolted her awake. She could not fail them. She would not allow her children to be born into a world that viewed them as defective currency. By nightfall on the 5th day, the storm escalated into an impassable, blinding wall of white fury. The snow rose to her thighs, trapping her legs in an icy vise. The wind roared, carrying the sound of shattering glaciers and cracking pine boughs. Lyra took one final trembling step, and her knees simply ceased to function. The sheer physical weight of the massive geode and her pregnant abdomen dragged her down into the crushing snow. She twisted her body mid-fall, taking the impact on her shoulder to protect the cargo strapped to her chest. The freezing snow immediately began to bury her, piling over her dark cloak in thick, heavy layers. Lyra curled herself into a tight, defensive sphere. She wrapped her freezing, unfeeling arms over the glowing lump beneath her cloak. The edges of her vision began to darken, collapsing inward into a heavy, peaceful blackness. The frantic, pulsing heat of the sunstone seemed to dim, its ancient magic finally overwhelmed by the sheer mass of the winter storm. She pressed her cracked lips to the wool covering her belly. A nobody who fades into the background will hardly be missed when she slips away. The thought drifted through her fading consciousness, no longer a bitter curse, but a quiet comfort. She was vanishing. She was finally disappearing completely, taking the true legacy of the southern lands with her into the freezing dark. Miles away, standing atop a jagged granite ridge, the most dangerous predator in the known realms faced the wind. Callan Thornmere, the Alpha King of the Northern Territory, was a beast of terrifying proportions. In his shifted form, he was a colossal wolf of midnight fur and winter storm eyes, commanding a physical presence that forced lesser wolves to bow in deep reverence. He was patrolling the outer rim of his sovereign borders, leading a vanguard of elite trackers through the worst blizzard of the decade. The northern wolves thrived in the ice. It was their armor, their weapon, and their sanctuary. Callan paused, his massive paws sinking deep into the fresh powder. His ears swiveled forward, twitching against the howling gale. The air in his territory always smelled of ozone, crushed pine needles, and clean, unyielding frost. But tonight, the fierce wind carried something utterly alien across the frozen tundra. The Alpha King flared his nostrils, drawing the scent deep into his lungs. It was the smell of dying autumn leaves, sweet wood smoke, and the faint, unmistakable scent of an exhausted Omega. Underneath that exhaustion, there was something else, a scent so ancient and profoundly powerful that it caused the fur along Callan's spine to bristle with electric tension. It smelled like dormant sunlight. It smelled like a locked vault holding a burning star. Without waiting for his vanguard, the massive black wolf launched himself down the steep, treacherous face of the ridge. He moved with a terrifying speed, an avalanche of muscle and shadow tearing through the blinding white storm. His instincts were overriding reason, driven by a sudden, fierce protective urge that he had not felt in centuries. He found the source of the scent half buried beneath a massive snowdrift at the base of a dead oak tree. Callan shifted back to his human form, the transition masked by the roaring wind. He towered over the snowdrift, a man of staggering physical power. Scars mapped his broad, bare chest, impervious to the biting frost. His piercing gaze narrowed sharply as he dropped to his knees, his massive hands digging rapidly into the packed ice. He unearthed the edge of a dark, frozen woolen cloak. Callan carefully brushed the snow away, revealing the pale, unconscious face of a young woman. Her skin was translucent, her lips tinged with a dangerous blue chill. But it was not her near-death state that made the formidable Lycan king freeze in absolute awe. It was the blinding, radiant golden light spilling out from beneath the collar of her ruined cloak. The magic was palpable. It hummed in the freezing air, vibrating with a frequency that resonated deep within Callan's own chest. He reached out his massive, scarred fingers, gently pulling the wool aside. He saw the heavy leather harness, the unpolished, glowing surface of the ancestral sunstone, and the undeniable, rounded swell of her late-stage pregnancy. This was no rogue wanderer. This was a vessel of supreme, forgotten divinity, cast out to face the ice alone. Callan looked down at her fragile, calloused hands. They were the hands of a servant, roughened by lye soap and hard labor. Yet she carried a magic that kings would burn entire continents to possess. The sheer injustice of her condition, the profound cruelty required to abandon a pregnant Omega in a winter storm, ignited a blinding protective fury within his chest. He carefully slid his arms beneath her freezing body, pulling her out of the snowbank. The moment he held her against his chest, her head rolled limply against his shoulder. The ancestral sunstone pressed against his skin, sending a rush of pure, molten heat through his veins. But it was the incredibly faint, desperate flutter of her pulse that anchored him. Because when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned, something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me. The silent vow echoed in the desolate chambers of his ancient soul. Callan Thornmere, a warlord, who had painted the northern glaciers with his enemy's defeat, wrapped his own heavy, fur-lined mantle tightly around the fragile woman. He shielded her completely from the biting wind, turning his back on the storm. With the exiled mother held safely against his heart, the Alpha King began the long march back toward the impenetrable sanctuary of his fortress. 9 months later, the howling blizzards of the outer tundra were nothing but a dull, distant whisper against the incredibly thick, enchanted glass windows of the northern court. Lyra Solis sat propped up against a mountain of heavy velvet pillows, her hands resting protectively over the massive taut swell of her abdomen. She had safely spent those 5 months within the warm sanctuary of the northern stronghold, carrying her twins to full term. The grueling, freezing nightmare of her escape felt like a different lifetime, a dark story belonging to a woman she no longer recognized. The chamber she now occupied was a masterpiece of luxurious safety. The walls were constructed of smooth, polished obsidian that captured and amplified the heat of the roaring hearth fire. Thick, impossibly soft pelts of snow bears covered the heated stone floors. The air smelled constantly of roasting cedar wood, sweet pine, and the rich, restorative spiced teas that the royal servants brought her every hour. Resting on a beautifully wrought iron pedestal near the fire was the ancestral sunstone. It was no longer a stolen, hidden secret. In the safety of this glacial fortress, the geode was allowed to breathe, bathing the entire cavernous room in a soft, perpetual golden twilight that kept the winter chill permanently at bay. The heavy oak door of the bedchamber clicked open, and Lyra looked up, a soft, genuine smile touching her lips. Callan ducked his head to clear the massive doorframe. The Lycan king had discarded his formal armor, wearing only a simple linen tunic and dark trousers. He carried a fresh tray of honeyed meats and steaming herbal broth. His winter storm eyes, usually so piercing and cold when addressing his generals, softened entirely the moment they landed on her. He moved with a quiet, deliberate caution, placing the tray gently on the bedside table before pulling a heavy wooden chair close to the mattress. He did not demand her attention. He did not issue orders. He simply sat beside her, radiating an aura of absolute unyielding protection. Lyra didn't know that the man sitting quietly by her bedded had buried 3 women who dared to love him. She did not know the tragic history of the Thornmere curses, or the sheer length to which he had gone to secure this exact room. She only knew that this towering, scarred sovereign treated her with a reverent devotion that terrified and anchored her all at once. "The perimeter is secure," Callan murmured, his voice a deep, soothing rumble that vibrated pleasantly in the quiet room. The southern passes had been sealed with intentional avalanches. No one from the Ironfall pack will ever breach this valley. "You are safe here, Lyra. They are safe." He briefly dropped his gaze to her swollen belly, his expression one of profound awe. Lyra reached out, her fingers lightly brushing the sleeve of his tunic. The physical contact was still new, still a tentative exploration of boundaries, but Callan remained perfectly still, allowing her to set the pace. She looked at the small, intricately carved wooden wolf he had left on her nightstand earlier that morning. A toy meant for hands that had not yet entered the world. "We are small things in a world of teeth, my little ones," Elira whispered softly to the child, moving steadily against her ribs. "Smallness is a gift. Use it." She had spent her entire life shrinking to survive, hiding her lineage and her intelligence just to avoid the wrath of arrogant nobility. But as she looked at the fearsome Lycan king, sitting in a wooden chair and watching her with absolute adoration, she realized she no longer needed to hide. Kalin was slowly teaching her that her quiet resilience was not a weakness. It was the very foundation of an undeniable sovereign strength. The peaceful domestic quiet was abruptly shattered. The first contraction rolled through Elira with an immense, undeniable force. She gasped sharply, her body shuddering with effort as her hands dug deep into the heavy crimson velvet of the sheets. The pressure was sudden and overwhelming, stealing the air directly from her lungs. The hollow, faded scar of her claiming mark suddenly flushed with an angry, burning heat. It was not the return of the severed mate bond. It was the immense, dormant cosmic energy of the sun-born lineage preparing to physically bring new life into the world. At the exact same moment, the ancestral sunstone on the pedestal reacted. The massive geode began to vibrate visibly, emitting a high-pitched, crystalline resonance that rattled the silver cups on the tray. The natural orange flames in the hearth roared suddenly higher, shifting instantly to a blinding, pure white fire. The ambient temperature in the cavernous stone chamber spiked, transforming the room into a furnace of divine energy. Kalin was on his feet in a fraction of a second, his stormy irises wide with a frantic, protective concern. For the first time in his centuries of ruling, the brilliant military tactician felt completely unmoored by the sudden shift in reality. "Healers!" Kalin bellowed, his voice carrying the commanding rumble of his alpha wolf, shaking the very health fountains of the keep. "Bring the royal midwives, now!" Within moments, the heavy doors opened, and a team of seasoned northern healers flooded into the superheated chamber. They moved with practiced efficiency, carrying linens, heated water, and soothing herbs. But as they approached the bed, they hesitated, intimidated by the sheer, overwhelming magical pressure radiating from the laboring mother. Kalin refused to leave the room. Protocol demanded that the Alpha King wait in the outer halls, but he firmly rejected the suggestion. Instead, he anchored himself firmly beside the headboard. He leaned over, offering his massive, heavily scarred hand to the panting Omega. Elira seized his hand with a crushing, desperate grip, drawing strength from his steady presence. Hours passed in an exhausting, demanding blur of intense effort and blinding magical light. The room was bathed in the overwhelming, golden resonance of the sunstone. Elira pushed through the exhaustion, drawing upon the deep, unyielding well of her maternal resolve. She channeled every ounce of her endurance, every memory of being mocked and discarded in the dying southern gardens, into pushing her children safely into the world. She focused entirely on the grounding presence of the Alpha King beside her. Kalin murmured constant, low words of encouragement in the ancient tongue of his ancestors, his free hand gently brushing the damp hair from her forehead. He absorbed the crushing pressure of her grip without flinching, his own breathing ragged with sympathetic adrenaline. "One final push, my lady. The first is almost here," the head midwife called out, her voice echoing over the roaring, white-hot flames of the hearth. With one final, earth-shattering effort, Elira arched her back, letting out a sharp, breathless gasp. The first cry pierced the heavy, superheated air of the chamber. It was a strong, vibrant sound that immediately cut through the magical resonance. Arthur Solis was born, glowing with a faint, protective silver light from the womb, his tiny fists already clenched in defiance of the cold world. Before Elira could even catch her breath, a second wave of contractions demanded her focus. The magic in the room flared dangerously bright, the sunstone humming so loudly it threatened to shatter the enchanted glass windows. Minutes later, the second cry joined the chorus. It was a slightly higher, more melodic sound that perfectly harmonized with her brother's wails. Lunara Solis took her first breath, bringing a sudden, profound stillness to the chaotic, magical energy in the room. The blinding white flames in the hearth instantly settled back into a warm, natural orange. The ancestral sunstone ceased its intense vibrating, returning to a soft, steady golden pulse. The grueling ordeal was over. The midwives moved with reverent, trembling hands, carefully wrapping the newborns in soft, heated silks. The sheer weight of the magical pressure had left the healers breathless. They approached the exhausted mother, gently placing the two bundled infants into her waiting arms. Elira, trembling with profound physical exhaustion and overwhelming relief, pulled the babies tightly against her chest. She rested her chin gently against the top of Arthur's head, breathing in the sweet, perfect scent of new life. As she adjusted the silks, the twins stirred. At the exact same moment, both Arthur and Lunara opened their eyes for the very first time. Midwives gasped, stumbling backward in absolute awe. They were not the dull, cloudy grey of normal wolf pups. The irises of both infants shifted instantly, locking onto their mother with a startling, impossible clarity. Their eyes burned with a fierce, molten gold fire. It was a glowing, celestial light that exactly mirrored the ancient, divine energy of the ancestral sunstone resting on the pedestal. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of their supreme divine heritage. The children of the mocked, outcast Omega were not broken. They were the physical embodiment of the legendary sun-born lineage, carrying a magical sovereign power that had not been seen in the world for 1,000 years. Calin Thornmere, the most dangerous predator in the northern realms, stared at the two golden-eyed miracles resting in Elira's arms. The fearsome beast who commanded armies and struck terror into the hearts of rival kings slowly, deliberately dropped to both knees beside the bed. He did not look at the glowing stone. He did not care about the massive political power these divine heirs represented to his territory. He simply looked at the exhausted, beautiful woman who had survived the impossible to bring light into his frozen world. Calin bowed his head, resting his forehead gently against the edge of her mattress. It was a gesture of complete, uncompromised devotion. The Alpha King yielded his entire kingdom, his immense power, and his ancient heart to the quiet woman and the golden-eyed future she held safely in her arms. The black soil of the southern fields shattered like brittle glass beneath Rowan Vance's heavy leather boots. 5 grueling years had passed since the night of the autumn equinox. 5 years since a violent, unseasonal thunderstorm had washed away the enduring warmth of the Ironfall Keep, leaving behind a perpetual, suffocating winter. Rowan knelt slowly in the center of the dead garden, his gloved hands scooping up a handful of the frozen dirt. It crumbled into grey, lifeless dust between his fingers, completely devoid of moisture, fertility, or the latent magic that had once made his territory the envy of the known realms. The heavy iron gates of the Ironfall Keep, once standing as a proud symbol of their impenetrable strength, now rusted on their ancient hinges. The entire fortress felt like a massive, decaying ribcage, trapping its inhabitants in a slow, agonizing death. The Alpha of the Southern Territory closed his storm-grey eyes, a deep, rattling sigh, tearing its way out of his broad chest. His once imposing physical frame had grown visibly leaner, hollowed out by a relentless, invisible starvation that no amount of roasted meat or heavy wine could cure. The physical decay of the agricultural land was merely a massive environmental mirror, reflecting the rotting decay of his own soul. His inner wolf, the fierce, dominant predator that had once commanded an army of 10,000 soldiers, now paced endlessly in the dark. It whined pitifully at the agonizing, cavernous void where his fated mate bond used to be. When he had first allowed the bond to be severed, he had expected a brief, stinging pain. He had expected the customary week of lethargy, before his superior alpha biology overrode the rejection and allowed him to claim a new, politically advantageous mate. He had been completely, catastrophically wrong. The severance had not healed. Instead, the phantom scar on his left hip throbbed with a ceaseless, freezing agony. It was a somatic nightmare that refused to end. Every time the winter wind howled against the stained glass windows of the keep, Rowan felt the ice settling deeper into his marrow. It was a sickening, continuous drag behind his ribs, a physical tether that had been violently snapped, leaving the frayed ends to burn against his internal organs. He could not sleep peacefully. He could not find genuine warmth, even when standing directly beside a roaring hearth fire. The cold was an entity, a living, breathing punishment that wrapped around his lungs and squeezed tighter with every passing day. And far worse than the excruciating physical pain was the absolute, deafening silence of his pack. He stood up, brushing the dead ash from his heavy velvet coat, and looked out over the desolate courtyard. There were no children playing near the frozen fountain. There were no young pups wrestling in the dry, yellowed grass. In 5 entire years, not a single pregnancy had been carried to term within the Ironfall borders. The Omegas wept inconsolably in the healing wards, their bodies mysteriously rejecting every desperate attempt to bring new life into the frozen world. The pack elders whispered in the shadowed corridors, casting terrified, deeply resentful glances at their failing leader. The pack was dying. The ancient lineage was suffocating under his reign, bleeding out onto the frozen earth drop by agonizing drop. "Rowan, my love, you are muddying your boots for absolutely nothing." The voice sliced through the freezing air, dripping with an artificial sweetness that immediately made the Alpha's jaw clench tight. Maria Sterling stood at the edge of the terrace, wrapped in layers of imported crimson velvet and thick silver fox furs. She carried an intricate silver hand warmer, her delicate, heavily powdered face twisted into a practiced mask of aristocratic disdain. The heavy furs must have cost a month's worth of the pack's remaining grain reserves, yet she wore them with casual entitlement, entirely blind to the suffering of the people she claimed to rule. The moment she stepped onto the dead grass, the overwhelming, cloying scent of her thick gardenia perfume rolled over the garden, choking out the crisp scent of the winter frost. For the first few months after his mate's quiet disappearance, Rowan had found a pathetic comfort in that specific scent. It had masked the sharp, metallic tang of his own guilt and the lingering smell of the storm. But as the long years dragged on, the Alpha's heightened senses had begun to penetrate the chemical sweetness of the expensive fragrance. Beneath the heavy layers of floral oil, the mistress smelled of stagnant pond water, sour ambition, and a deep biological rot. She was beautiful in the way a poisoned apple was beautiful. Flawless and polished on the surface, but entirely lethal to consume. "The eastern fields have failed again," Rowan said, his voice flat, completely devoid of the passionate warmth he had once freely offered her in secret. "The soil is dead, Maria. The winter wheat did not even sprout this morning. The lower packs are already butchering their precious breeding stock just to survive the month. The granaries are empty, and the frost has claimed the northern outposts. The lower packs are always complaining about something," the aristocrat scoffed, waving her gloved hand dismissively. She stepped carefully over the frozen ruts in the earth, ensuring her pristine silk hems did not touch the dirt. "They lack basic discipline. If you would simply send the vanguard to tax their hidden grain reserves, we would not be forced to drink this dreadful, watered-down wine at the high table. It is embarrassing. Rowan, the visiting dignitaries from the western borders, are beginning to mock our hospitality." Rowan stared at her. He truly, deeply stared at the woman he had chosen over his fated mate. She did not ask about the starving children in the lower villages. She did not express a single ounce of sorrow for the barren mothers weeping in the dark infirmaries. Her only concern was the quality of the honeyed wine and the fragile perception of her own hollow social status. She was a hollow vessel, completely incapable of the protective, sacrificial love that defined a true Luna. He remembered, with a sudden, violent clarity, the image of a quiet Omega kneeling on the cold stone floors, scrubbing the hearth while the rest of the keep slept. He remembered the rough calluses on her fingers, the silent, enduring dignity in her storm-grey eyes, and the gentle, unassuming warmth that had always surrounded her presence in a room. She did not complain. She did not beg. He had publicly called her weak. He had allowed this toxic, superficial parasite to convince him that a quiet, observant woman was a broken thing. "There will be no grand banquet for the Western dignitaries," the fallen leader growled, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, feral edge that made the frozen rosebushes tremble. "There is no grain left to tax. The vanguard is too weak from rationing to march on our own people. We are starving, Maria. Do you not understand the reality of our situation? The entire pack is starving." Maria flinched violently at his harsh tone, her practiced, sweet smile faltering. She reached out, attempting to lay a soothing, manipulative hand on his chest. "You are just tired from the cold, my alpha. Come inside the keep. Let the common servants worry about the dirt. I have ordered them to draw a hot bath, and I am wearing the sheer silk you once favored." As her gloved fingers touched the lapel of his coat, Rowan felt a visceral, overwhelming surge of revulsion. It was a physical sickness, a biological rejection so powerful it made his inner wolf bare its teeth in the dark recesses of his mind. He stepped backward sharply, leaving her hand suspended awkwardly in the freezing air. The gardenia scent, once an intoxicating lure, now turned his stomach. "Do not touch me," he whispered, his tone carrying the absolute, unyielding cold of the northern glaciers. The mistress's eyes widened in genuine shock, her pale face flushing with a sudden, humiliated fury. She opened her mouth to argue, undoubtedly preparing to deploy the calculated tears that had once controlled his every political decision. But Rowan did not give her the chance to speak. He turned his back on the woman, leaving her standing entirely alone in the poisoned, dead garden. He did not return to the luxurious warmth of the upper keep. Instead, his heavy boots carried him downward, descending the steep, spiraling stone staircases into the deepest, darkest catacombs of the estate. The air grew progressively colder with every step, smelling strongly of ancient dust, dry earth, and forgotten secrets. The shadows clung to the damp walls, mirroring the desolate wasteland of his own ruined heart. Every torch sputtered and died as he passed, suffocated by the heavy, necrotic energy radiating from his failing aura. He walked past the heavily armored sentries guarding the primary vault. They snapped to absolute attention, but Rowan could easily smell the sour tang of their fear. They were guarding a tomb. For 5 long years, the jagged obsidian pedestal at the center of the massive room had sat completely empty, a glaring, permanent monument to his colossal failure as a leader. At first, Rowan had arrogantly believed the theft of the relic was a mere act of petty spite. He had assumed his discarded mate had taken the heavy, unpolished geode to sell to merchants for safe passage. But as the land withered and the Omegas mysteriously became barren, the desperate pack elders had begun to panic. They had scoured the ancient archives, frantically trying to understand why the sudden loss of the ancestral sunstone had triggered an apocalyptic decay across the territory. Rowan pushed open the heavy oak door to the ancestral archives. It was a massive, cavernous room filled with towering shelves of rotting parchment and heavy, leather-bound tomes. The air here was suffocating, heavy with the terrifying weight of forgotten history. He walked directly to the large wooden table in the center of the room. Resting in the flickering candlelight was a fragile, ancient grimoire, its delicate pages carefully preserved under thick glass. The elders had left it open to a specific, highlighted passage, a text written in the harsh, angular runes of the first Lycan kings. He pulled the glass casing back, his fingers trembling so violently they rattled against the wood. Rowan leaned his palms heavily against the table, his storm-grey eyes scanning the faded ink. He had read the translation 100 times over the past month, but tonight the words seemed to burn directly into his retinas with a damning clarity. The text detailed the physical markers of a forgotten supreme goddess bloodline, the radiant molten gold eyes, the ability to command pure, white-hot elemental fire, and most terrifyingly, the text explicitly stated that the sacred ancestral sunstone was biologically, irrevocably bound to the direct descendants of those first queens. The stolen ancestral sunstone was bound to the earth, the ancient text warned. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be. If the ancestral sunstone is removed by an unworthy hand, it will instantly turn to ash. But if it is carried away by the true, living vessel, the land it leaves behind will suffer the severing. The earth will mirror the broken bond. The soil will freeze. The wombs will empty. The pack will fade into the endless void. Rowan's hands began to tremble violently. The heavy oak table creaked and groaned under his sudden, crushing grip. She had not stolen a decorative rock. She had not fenced a piece of silver to survive. She had walked into the heavily guarded vault and claimed the beating heart of his entire kingdom, and the ancient sunstone had allowed her to take it. It had not turned to ash. It had remained whole, which meant the quiet, unassuming Omega he had openly mocked as a barren, wolfless creature was the true, living heir of the legendary Sunborn lineage. The sheer, staggering magnitude of his own blind hubris crashed over him like a collapsing mountain. He stumbled backward, his breathing ragged, his chest heaving as the true horrifying panic finally took root in his soul. The arrogant certainty that had defined his entire reign shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He needed absolute answers. He needed to know exactly what had happened in the shadows on the night she vanished. "Bring the old woman to me," Rowan bellowed into the empty stone corridor, his voice cracking painfully under the strain of his despair. Bring Nora Lindwood to the archives now. It took 10 agonizing minutes for the royal guards to march the elderly kitchen servant down into the freezing catacombs. Nora looked incredibly small, standing between the heavily armored sentries. Her grey hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her coarse woolen apron was heavily stained with flour and lye soap. But as the guards forced her into the dim candlelight of the archives and stepped back, she did not tremble. She had survived 3 different alphas in this brutal keep. She had scrubbed the blood of their enemies from the flagstones. She did not fear the broken, desperate man standing before her. She merely looked at the towering alpha with a gaze of profound, devastating pity. "Leave us," Rowan commanded the guards, his voice shaking uncontrollably. The heavy iron doors slammed shut, sealing them in the dusty, suffocating silence. Rowan stepped toward the old woman, his massive frame casting a terrifying, jagged shadow against the weeping stone walls. He was entirely unraveled. The polished, invincible veneer of the alpha was completely destroyed. "You helped her," Rowan rasped, his voice reduced to a broken, pleading whisper. "The guards reported that you served them spiced ale the night the vault was breached. You provided the necessary distraction. You helped her bypass the iron doors." Nora did not attempt to deny it. She simply folded her calloused hands neatly in front of her apron and lifted her chin to meet his furious gaze. "I did, Alpha Vance. I gave her the heavy winter cloak from the kitchen stores. I distracted your sentries. I watched her walk out into the freezing storm." Rowan's eyes flashed with a dangerous, feral gold. He grabbed the edge of the wooden table, his knuckles turning stark white. "Why? Why would you commit high treason for a low-ranking servant? Why would you help her steal the ancestral sunstone and doom us all?" "She did not steal it," Nora replied evenly, her voice steady and entirely devoid of intimidation. "She reclaimed it. It belonged to her bloodline, Alpha. Just as the pack should have belonged to her. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced, because she was never there to begin with. You never truly saw Alira, did you? She was broken, Rowan roared, the sound echoing violently off the stone walls. The desperate, pathetic denial tore from his throat, a final attempt to justify his catastrophic, life-altering mistake. She could not shift. She was weak, Nora, a completely barren omega. The old servant slowly shook her head, a sad, profoundly knowing smile touching the corners of her weathered mouth. She was not barren, Rowan, Nora whispered softly, dropping the formal pack title entirely. She was carrying your heirs. The words struck the Alpha like a physical crushing blow to the skull. The air completely vanished from his lungs. The freezing ache in his severed mark suddenly flared into a blinding, white-hot agony that dropped him straight to his knees on the cold flagstones. Rowan stared up at the servant, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. His vision blurred rapidly, the edges of the dark room spinning wildly out of control. The revelation was a blade driven directly through his chest, twisting without mercy. She was 4 months pregnant the night she stood in the shadows of the garden and listened to you and your mistress laugh at her. Nora continued, her voice echoing with an absolute, merciless truth. She was carrying twins. I saw the swell of her belly beneath her apron. I felt the pure, glowing heat radiating from her skin when she touched my arm. The children inside her were starving for the magic of their ancestors, and they were dying in this poisoned keep. She did not take the ancestral sunstone out of spite. She took it to keep your babies alive. She vanished like smoke through a crack in the world, and she took the children with her. No, 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 Rowan choked out, wrapping his massive arms tightly around his own chest as the physical pain threatened to rip him entirely apart. The chant was a helpless, broken litany of absolute despair. He had not just thrown away a quiet, fated mate. He had thrown away his own flesh and blood. He had deliberately discarded twin heirs who carried the supreme, divine magic of the sun-born kings. While he had been standing in the dead garden, complaining about watered-down wine and holding the hand of a rotting, barren aristocrat, his true mate had dragged her pregnant body through a howling winter storm to protect his children from his own cruelty. The alpha wolf inside his mind did not just whimper. It tore at the fragile walls of his consciousness, letting out a long, agonizing howl of total surrender. The grief was oceanic. It drowned his immense pride, his burning anger, and his remaining shreds of royal dignity. Rowan Vance, the feared commander of the Ironfall pack, curled forward on the dusty stone floor. He pressed his forehead against the freezing granite as he wept openly, violently, in front of a kitchen servant. The bitter salt of his tears did absolutely nothing to melt the frost forming on the flagstones. He was a king of nothing, ruling over a graveyard of his own making. Where did she go? He begged, his voice muffled by the stone, his hot tears leaving dark, wet stains on the ancient dust. Please, Nora, where did she take my children? The old woman looked down at the broken monster, weeping helplessly at her feet. She did not offer him a single ounce of comfort. She did not reach out to soothe his pain, because this absolute agony was entirely self-inflicted. It was the undeniable, horrific price of his arrogance. I do not know where the winter wind carried her, Nora said quietly, turning her back on the weeping alpha and walking toward the heavy oak doors. But I know she does not weep for you, because being let go had allowed me to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and I would never ever look back. She is a mother who holds the sun, and you are nothing but the fading shadow she left behind. As the heavy iron door closed, leaving Rowan entirely alone in the suffocating darkness of the archives, the phantom mark on his hip burned with a sudden, localized intensity. It was a faint, agonizing pulse originating from thousands of miles away, pulling his shattered soul forcefully toward the impenetrable, freezing borders of the far north. He had to find them. He had to crawl on his hands and knees across the frozen continent if he had to. He would burn the world down to reclaim his hidden heirs and the woman he had so foolishly cast aside. The physical journey across the frozen expanse of the continent took 3 agonizing weeks. Rowan Vance did not travel with a royal vanguard. He did not ride in a heated, velvet-lined carriage, nor did he carry the proud, imposing banners of the Southern Territory. The fallen Alpha walked the desolate, blinding path entirely alone. He was dragged relentlessly forward by the sickening, ceaseless pulse of the severed, claiming mark on his left hip, pulling his shattered soul forcefully toward the impenetrable, freezing borders of the far north. The heavy coat that had once been a symbol of his immense, untouchable wealth was now shredded at the hem, frozen stiff with layers of biting frost and dried, blackened mud. His leather boots, crafted for the soft, manicured soil of his dying gardens, cracked and split against the unforgiving, jagged ice of the northern permafrost. Every step was a masterclass in physical agony. The wind in the Thornmere Mountains did not merely blow. It shrieked like a wounded beast, carrying microscopic shards of ice that tore at his exposed skin. Rowan's face was hollow, his cheekbones jutting out sharply beneath pale, frostbitten flesh. His inner wolf, the fierce predator that had once commanded absolute authority over 10,000 soldiers, was reduced to a whimpering, starving shadow in the dark recesses of his mind. It clawed desperately at the cavernous void in his chest, starved of the fated warmth it had so arrogantly discarded. Yet, beneath the excruciating physical decay, a pathetic, desperate delusion kept the man moving. He convinced himself, with every agonizing step through the knee-deep snowdrifts, that Elira was suffering. He forced his mind to believe that the quiet, unassuming Omega was trapped in the freezing wilderness, hiding in the dark, weeping for the home she had fled. He told himself that he was a merciful sovereign, coming to rescue his runaway servant. He would offer her a grand public pardon for stealing the ancestral sunstone. He would bring her back to the keep, dissolve his disastrous arrangement with his rotting mistress, and allow Elira to take her rightful place in the shadows of his own keep. He was wrong, because the Alpha King had finally discovered the truth, and he was coming for what was his. The twisted mantra echoed in his deteriorating mind, completely blinding him to the absolute ruin he had brought upon himself. When Rowan finally crested the final treacherous ridge, the hallucination of his own supremacy shattered against the undeniable reality of the northern court. It was not a decaying, starving ribcage of a fortress like the Ironfall Keep. The citadel of Thornmere was a staggering architectural marvel carved directly into the heart of the glacial mountain. Massive walls of polished, seamless obsidian rose hundreds of feet into the howling sky, entirely impervious to the apocalyptic blizzard raging around them. Thick, enchanted glass windows glowed with a fierce, ambient heat, casting a beautiful, protective golden twilight over the heavy snow. The air here did not smell of decay or stagnant pond water. It was sharp with the scent of ozone, crushed pine needles, and the deep, rich aroma of roasting cedar wafting from the high chimneys. Rowan stumbled down the icy slope, his frozen breath pluming rapidly in the bitter air. He reached the colossal iron-wrought gates of the outer courtyard, his trembling, blood-stained hands grabbing the freezing metal bars. "Open the gates!" he bellowed, though his voice was a ragged, pathetic rasp, completely swallowed by the roaring wind. He rattled the heavy iron with the last remnants of his failing alpha strength. "I am Rowan Vance, Alpha of the Southern Territory. Open these gates immediately." For a long, agonizing minute, the fortress remained completely silent, entirely indifferent to the starving beggar screaming at its threshold. Then, the grinding shriek of ancient gears echoed through the valley. The massive obsidian doors slowly parted, groaning against the packed ice. A wave of localized, immense magical pressure instantly flooded out of the courtyard, slamming into Rowan with the physical force of a falling avalanche. It was an aura of such absolute, terrifying dominance that his knees immediately buckled, forcing him to grip the iron bars just to remain standing. Through the parting gates walked the most dangerous predator in the known realms. Calin Thornmere did not wear heavy furs or layered velvet to combat the cold. The Alpha King of the North wore a simple, sleeveless tunic of dark leather and heavy steel gauntlets, entirely unaffected by the biting blizzard. He was a beast of terrifying proportions, his massive, heavily scarred frame projecting an aura of lethal, unyielding sovereignty. His winter storm eyes locked onto the broken southern leader with a gaze of profound, freezing disgust. He did not look at the man as a fellow king. He looked at him as a piece of dead rot that had unfortunately washed up on his pristine shores. Flanking the towering Lycan king were 24 elite northern guards, their silver armor gleaming in the ambient light. They did not raise their weapons. They did not need to. The sheer, overwhelming presence of their ruler was enough to suffocate any threat. "You trespass on sovereign land, Southerner," Kalin's voice rumbled. It was not a shout, yet the deep, vibrating baritone carried effortlessly over the howling wind, chilling Rowan's blood faster than the ice. "Speak your purpose before my guards remove you from the snow, permanently." Rowan's jaw clenched, his pride violently rejecting the physical urge to submit to the overwhelming alpha aura pressing down on his spine. He forced himself to stand taller, pulling his shredded coat tightly around his hollow chest. "I have not come to challenge your borders, Thornmere," the southern leader rasped, trying desperately to inject the commanding tone of his past into his broken voice. "I have come to collect my property. A servant of my pack, an Omega named Elira, crossed into your lands 5 years ago. She is a thief. She stole a sacred relic from my vault, and I demand you return her to my custody immediately." The silence that followed was absolute. The elite northern guards did not move a single muscle, but a collective, dangerous tension rippled through their ranks. The very air around the courtyard seemed to drop 10 degrees, the frost crystallizing rapidly on the iron gates. Kalin did not blink. The colossal king simply tilted his head, his tempestuous gaze narrowing into terrifying slits. "A servant," he repeated, the word carrying a lethal, quiet edge. "You crawled across a frozen continent, starving and broken, to demand the return of a servant you believe belongs in your shadow." "She is my fated mate," Rowan snapped, the bitter truth finally tearing its way out of his throat. The desperate admission tasted like ash. "She carries my heirs. Return her to me. Kalin, I will pay whatever ransom you demand in silver or land, but she is coming back to the Ironfall Keep today." The Lycan king let out a low, vibrating sound. It was not a laugh. It was a feral, terrifying growl that originated deep within his massive chest, promising immediate, catastrophic violence. "You have no silver," the towering beast replied softly, stepping closer until his massive shadow completely eclipsed the shivering southern alpha. "You have no land. Your territory is a graveyard of dead soil and barren wombs, and you have absolutely no right to speak her name with your rotting mouth." Before Rowan could summon the breath to argue, Kalin turned his massive shoulders, gesturing to his heavily armored guards. "Bring the beggar inside," the Lycan king commanded coldly, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. "Let him see exactly what he threw away before I bury him in the ice." The elite guard stepped forward, their silver gauntlets seizing Rowan's trembling, half-starved frame. They dragged him effortlessly through the sprawling outer courtyard and shoved him violently through the colossal enchanted double doors of the inner keep. The transition from the howling blizzard outside to the interior of the grand throne room was a staggering sensory shock. A rush of dry, pure molten heat washed over Rowan's freezing skin. It was not the smoky, suffocating warmth of a wood fire. It was the blinding, radiant heat of the summer sun, carrying the unmistakable scent of blooming life, ancient magic, and absolute safety. The temperature in the cavernous obsidian hall spiked instantly, melting the thick layer of frost on Rowan's tattered coat into warm, dripping water. Massive pillars of polished black stone lined the vast chamber, leading up to a towering dais. Rowan braced himself, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The phantom claiming mark on his hip flared with a blinding, desperate agony, screaming that the missing piece of his soul was finally within reach. He expected to see a terrified, shivering woman wrapped in the faded woolen cloak of a kitchen maid, standing in the shadows of the northern palace. He expected a broken creature who would weep with relief at the sight of her alpha coming to reclaim her. Instead, it became the moment his entire reality fractured beyond repair. Seated gracefully upon a magnificent throne of carved white stone and spun gold was a vision of supreme, untouchable divinity. Alira Solis did not wear the coarse, stained apron of the lower ranks. She was draped in heavy, flowing royal robes of deep crimson silk and bright celestial gold. The fabric shimmered with an internal, radiant light, trailing elegantly over the dark stone of the dais. The rough calluses were entirely gone from her hands, replaced by the soft, glowing skin of a woman who had spent 5 years being worshipped, protected, and cherished. Delicate chains of pure sun gold rested against her collarbones, but they were nothing compared to the overwhelming, visible aura of magic that surrounded her. The air around her literally warped with ambient heat. A faint, glowing halo of molten sparks drifted from her fingertips. She was the physical embodiment of the legendary Sunborn lineage, fully awakened and entirely sovereign. Kalin Thornmere, the most feared warlord in the Northern Territories, walked slowly up the obsidian stairs of the dais. He did not stand in front of her to shield her from the conflict, as if she were a fragile possession. He moved with deliberate, reverent caution, taking his place exactly beside her. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the Radiant Queen, offering his immense, terrifying physical power as a quiet, devoted extension of her own will. But the absolute devastation of Rowan's soul did not end with the breathtaking sight of the woman he had discarded. Standing proudly at the foot of the throne, entirely unafraid of the starving southern alpha, were 2 children, a boy and a girl, barely 5 years old, yet projecting an aura of immense, undeniable power. Arthur and Lunara Solis. They were dressed in immaculate, silver-threaded northern garments, their small postures radiating the fierce, regal confidence of true royalty. They did not inherit the weak, rotting bloodline of the Ironfall Keep. As they stared down at the trembling intruder, their eyes shifted simultaneously from a stormy grey to a burning, molten gold. Rowan's breath completely stopped. The physical pain in his chest was so profound, so utterly devastating, that his legs simply ceased to function. He collapsed heavily to both knees upon the polished obsidian floor, the wet slush from his boots pooling beneath him. These were not ordinary pups. They were the legendary twins, the hidden heirs of the sun-born magic, carrying the supreme elemental potential that would shape the destiny of the entire continent. The future of his pack, his future. He had traded them, traded all of this unimaginable power and radiant life for the toxic, barren touch of Maria Sterling in a dead, decaying garden. This was not a servant. This was a high goddess queen, flanked by a king who worshipped her and the divine heirs who would inherit the world. The cognitive dissonance tore through his deteriorating mind, shredding the last pathetic remnants of his delusion. The woman he had publicly mocked, the mate he had called barren dirt, was radiating a divine magic that dwarfed the power of 100 alphas. He stared up at the high throne, his hollow eyes wide with a horrified, absolute realization of what he had casually thrown away. Alira looked down at the starving, broken man kneeling in the slush of her immaculate floor. Her expression was completely unreadable. There was no anger in her beautiful face. There was no lingering affection, no secret longing, and certainly no fear. Her eyes were clear, steady, and entirely devoid of the deep, agonizing love she had once held for him in secret. She looked at him with the quiet, observant detachment of a sovereign assessing a ragged stranger who had trespassed on her land. Rowan opened his mouth, desperately trying to force the words past the massive, suffocating lump in his throat. He wanted to invoke the ancient laws. He wanted to scream that he was sorry, that he had been blind, manipulated, and foolish. He wanted to beg for the warmth radiating from her skin, Elira. The fallen king choked out, the single word, breaking into a pathetic, desperate sob. He reached out a trembling, frost-bitten hand toward the towering throne, his fingers grasping helplessly at the empty, warm air. Please, I came for you. I came for our children. The quiet, radiant queen did not flinch at the sound of his weeping. She did not clutch her chest, and the faint, glowing, claiming mark that now adorned Kaelin's massive wrist proved that the ancient, empty void in her soul had been completely, permanently filled by a better man. You came for a servant who never existed, Alpha Vance, she replied. Her voice was not a whisper. It was calm, resonant, and carried the absolute, unyielding authority of the sun itself. An uncherished phantom cannot be summoned back once the illusion is broken. The woman you cast aside died in the snow 5 years ago. I am the queen of the northern court. These are the heirs of Thornmere, and you have nothing left that belongs to me. You are banished from this land forever. The absolute finality of her words hung in the superheated air of the obsidian throne room, refusing to be unsaid. The decree of permanent banishment echoed against the towering black pillars, a flawless, ringing testament to the sovereign power Elira Solis now commanded. Rowan Vance could not process the rejection. His deteriorating mind simply rejected the reality of his total, humiliating defeat. He was an alpha. He was the sovereign commander of the Ironfall Keep, a man born to rule, born to command absolute obedience from the lower ranks. The frantic, starving beast inside his chest clawed desperately at his bruised ribcage. It refused to accept that the magnificent, golden-eyed children standing on the dais were forever beyond his reach. A ragged, wet gasp tore its way out of his throat, sounding like the final rattle of a dying animal. He forced his bleeding hands flat against the wet stone floor, his frost-bitten joints popping sickeningly as he stubbornly pushed himself upright. "No," Rowan rasped, the single syllable vibrating with a sudden, toxic surge of desperate authority. "No, I will not accept this. You are my fated mate, Elira, and those are my pups. They carry the blood of the southern kings in their veins. They belong to my territory." He squeezed his storm-grey eyes shut, attempting to summon the dominating, oppressive aura of his alpha lineage. It was a pathetic, foolish gamble born of sheer desperation. The dark, heavy pheromones of his dominance rolled out across the cavernous chamber. His aura smelled of damp earth, dying autumn leaves, and stagnant desperation, a foul stench that immediately clashed with the pure, cedar-scented air of the northern palace. He aimed the oppressive, invisible wave directly at the 2 5-year-old children. He fully expected their developing wolves to instinctively cower and submit to their biological sire. He expected them to drop to their knees, expose their throats, and weep in absolute terror at the wrath of a true pack leader. Instead, Arthur Solis simply tilted his small head. The young boy did not flinch. He did not step backward behind the protective folds of his mother's crimson silk robes, nor did he seek the towering shadow of Calin Thornmere for shelter. He stepped forward. The heavy, dark pressure of Rowan's alpha aura hit the child and instantly shattered, breaking apart like brittle glass, striking a solid anvil of iron. The ambient temperature in the massive throne room spiked violently. It was not a gradual, comforting warming of the hearth. It was an explosive, localized detonation of pure, blinding summer heat. Arthur's eyes, already a striking shade of molten gold, suddenly flared with a terrifying, incandescent brilliance. The boy was merely 5 years old, yet the magical pressure he effortlessly unleashed was staggering in its magnitude. A colossal, ethereal silhouette of a massive silver-white wolf materialized in the air directly behind the child. The spectral beast radiated an aura of absolute, untouched divine power, completely illuminating the dark corners of the throne room. The celestial wolf bared its teeth, letting out a silent, world-shaking roar that vibrated violently through the obsidian floorboards and rattled the enchanted glass windows of the keep. Rowan staggered backward, his breath catching painfully in his throat, as the blistering heat washed over his frost-bitten face. The sudden extreme shift in temperature caused the fragile, frozen skin on his cheekbones to literally blister and crack. Beside her brother, Lunara Solis stepped forward, her own golden eyes locking onto the trembling intruder. She did not project a massive physical wolf silhouette. Her inheritance of the supreme Sunborn lineage manifested entirely in the ancient, terrifying gift of divine truth's sight. She looked right past Rowan's shredded velvet coat. She looked past his starving physical frame, and she stared directly into the cavernous, rotting void of his soul. "You have no light inside your chest," the young girl spoke. Her voice was soft, yet it carried a bizarre, overlapping harmonic resonance. It echoed through the vast hall, as if a chorus of ancient, forgotten queens were speaking through her tiny frame. "You let the earth die because you are completely hollow," Lunara continued, her molten gold eyes completely devoid of childhood innocence. "There is nothing left for you to take from us. You are just a shadow." As she spoke, it's the absolute, undeniable truth. The twin heirs synchronized their breathing. A shockwave of pure, blazing solar energy erupted from their small bodies. It swept across the throne room with the unstoppable, crushing force of a tidal wave made of solid sunlight. It slammed into Rowan Vance with catastrophic physical weight. The Southern Alpha did not even have the breath to scream. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of the divine sunborn magic crushed his dark aura instantly, erasing his dominance from the air. It was a somatic failure of epic proportions. His inner wolf, the fierce creature that had once demanded the absolute obedience of an entire territory, completely collapsed in a state of paralyzing, whimpering terror. The beast threw itself onto its back within his mind, utterly submitting to the apex predators standing upon the dais. Rowan was violently forced back down to the floor. His knees struck the obsidian stone with a sickening, audible crack. The overwhelming magical pressure continued to build, pressing heavily against his spine until his chest was flattened completely against the wet flagstones. He could not lift his arms. He could not turn his head to look away. He was pinned beneath the invisible, suffocating weight of his own children's supremacy. The dirty slush, pooling beneath his shredded clothes, instantly began to boil. The freezing water evaporated into thin wisps of hissing steam, leaving behind only dry, scorched earth. The agonizing heat blistered his frozen fingers, yet his muscles were completely paralyzed by the divine command. He lay there, trembling uncontrollably. He was a broken, starving beggar being effortlessly dominated by the 5-year-old heirs he had once dismissed as defective. Barren dirt. The humiliation was absolute, tearing away the very last, pathetic shreds of his sanity and his pride. For several agonizing minutes, the massive obsidian hall was filled only with the ragged, desperate sound of Rowan struggling to draw shallow breaths against the crushing, magical pressure. He was drowning in the blinding light of their perfection. Then Lycan Solis gracefully lifted a single, glowing hand. Instantly, the blinding solar aura radiating from the twins receded. The colossal silver-white wolf silhouette faded back into the ambient light, and the crushing weight pressing down on Rowan's spine vanished. He gasped violently, pulling huge, greedy lungfuls of the sharp, cedar-scented air into his hollow chest. His entire body shook with the violent aftershocks of his total, humiliating submission. He weakly turned his head against the warm stone, his vision swimming with dark spots. As his eyes slowly focused through the blur of his own tears, he finally saw it. Resting upon a magnificent, iron-wrought pedestal directly beside the high throne was the ancestral sunstone. It was no longer a dull, unpolished geode, sitting in a dusty, forgotten vault in the freezing south. The sacred relic was breathtaking in its awakened state. It pulsed with a deep, rhythmic golden light, perfectly synchronized with the steady beating of the Queen's heart. The ancient magic poured out of the stone in visible, shimmering waves, effortlessly feeding the prosperous, invincible sanctuary of the sovereign citadel. Rowan stared at the glorious artifact, his heart shattering completely as he truly understood the catastrophic scale of his failure. The literal beating heart of his pack was thriving here, surrounded by love and absolute devotion, while his own land suffocated under an endless, barren ice. "Elira," he whispered, a pathetic, broken sound that scraped painfully against his raw throat. He reached out a trembling, blistered hand across the stone floor. His fingers curled desperately, grasping at the empty, warm air. "I am dying," Rowan sobbed, the tears sizzling as they hit the heated obsidian. "Pack's dying." "Maria was a poison, a rotting mistake. I was blind, Elira. I was so arrogant. Please, you must show me the mercy I denied you. You are my true mate." Callan Thornmere moved then. The towering Lycan king did not bother to draw the heavy, round broadsword strapped to his back. He did not need a weapon of steel to deal with a crushed, weeping insect. The colossal beast stepped deliberately down the stairs of the dais, placing his massive, heavily scarred body firmly between the weeping intruder and his family. The protective stance was absolute, a physical wall of lethal muscle and unyielding devotion. "You were given a final judgment, Southerner," Callan's voice rumbled, the sound vibrating ominously through the polished floorboards like an impending earthquake. "Your voice pollutes the air my children breathe. You will not speak directly to my queen ever again." Elira stood up from the throne. The heavy crimson silk of her royal robes whispered softly against the stone as she descended the dais, stopping just behind Callan's broad shoulder. Rowan looked up at her, desperately searching her stunning, radiant face for a single ounce of the quiet, enduring love she had once harbored for him in secret. He searched for anger, for fierce hatred, for any shred of emotion that proved he still mattered to her in some twisted way. He found absolutely nothing. Her storm-grey eyes were entirely calm. They possessed the terrifying, serene detachment of a high goddess looking down upon a ragged stranger. The opposite of true love was not violent hatred. It was absolute, unyielding apathy. The quiet Omega who had once scrubbed his floors and wept in his shadows was gone, replaced entirely by a sovereign who did not even view him as a threat. "There is no mercy left to give, Rowan," Elira said, her tone perfectly even, completely devoid of malice or sorrow. "You chose the poison in your garden. You chose to value superficial compliance and political convenience over true devotion." She looked at the pathetic, broken man shivering on her floor, and she felt only a profound, settling peace within her own soul. The freezing terror that had haunted her escape through the winter blizzard 5 years ago was finally, permanently extinguished. "Thank you for letting me go. Because being let go had allowed me to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and I would never, ever look back." She did not break eye contact as she delivered her final, unbreakable command. "Remove him from my territory," the Sunborn Queen ordered, her voice echoing with the finality of a closing tomb. "If he ever crosses the borders of Thornmere again, execute him without trial." The elite Northern Guards did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. Heavy silver gauntlets seized Rowan by the shoulders, dragging his limp, exhausted body backward across the polished obsidian floor. He tried to fight, kicking his broken boots weakly against the stone, but his physical strength was entirely gone. He was hauled backward, away from the radiant warmth of the sunstone, away from the magnificent golden-eyed twins, and away from the only woman who could have ever saved his rotting soul. The colossal, iron-wrought double doors of the inner keep began to close. Through the rapidly narrowing gap, Rowan watched Calais turn his back on the commotion, completely dismissing the Southern Alpha's existence. The terrifying, heavily scarred warlord immediately dropped to his knees beside Arthur and Lunara. His fierce, lethal expression melted instantly into absolute, unconditional adoration as he gently checked his children over, making sure the magical exertion had not drained them. Elira stepped forward, resting her soft, glowing hand against the side of Callan's scarred face. The massive beast leaned into her gentle touch, closing his winter storm eyes in pure, undisturbed contentment. It was a picture of perfect, unbreakable domestic peace, a sanctuary built upon mutual reverence, shared warmth, and absolute safety. Then, the heavy obsidian doors slammed shut with a deafening boom. The blinding golden light was instantly severed. Rowan Vance was thrown violently out into the howling, apocalyptic blizzard of the outer courtyard. The freezing wind immediately swallowed his agonizing screams of total despair. He was left entirely alone in the biting dark, a banished ghost, condemned to wander the freezing wasteland with nothing but the devastating memory of the divine family he had thrown away. Inside the warm, superheated sanctuary of the throne room, the silence settled pleasantly over the royal family. The ambient light of the ancestral sunstone pulsed with a quiet, joyful rhythm, warming the dark stone. Alira ran her fingers gently through Callan's dark hair, looking down at the two incredibly powerful, golden-eyed children holding tightly onto their father's leather tunic, the faint claiming mark on her hip, now bearing Callan's unique, protective, magical signature, warmed pleasantly against her skin. She had arrived in this brutal winter landscape as a starving, broken outcast with nothing but a stolen stone and a desperate prayer. She had walked away from the humiliation in silence, leaving a dying pack to reap the ashes of their own cruelty. In the quiet, frozen dark, she had built an empire of undeniable warmth and sovereign power. The golden reign of the Sunborn Queen had finally secured its legacy, and her family was perfectly, permanently safe.